Sadly, we know too much about a lot of Donald Trump's corrupt pardons. It seems that every day, while he tries to cover them up, we're learning about more and more of these horrific pardons of some of the biggest fraudsters and drug traffickers and people who aid and abet sex trafficking. And just every day, he just hands them out, hands them out. And then it also has a restitution component to it. But are there also pardons that we just don't know about yet, that investigative journalism has not found? Does Donald Trump have a secret stash of corrupt pardons for himself, for his entire family, for his cabinet that's involved in all of these crimes against humanity and war crimes? Are they just sitting there in a pile? And has he basically handed them out to people as also part of his quid pro quo behavior that we see? I mean, look, you wake up in the morning and you see something like this, though. This is from Kyle Cheney, Politico. The latest round of Trump pardons primarily centers on people convicted of fraud. And New York Times did a good report on this last week, so a lot of these names are familiar. Adriana Cambreros, who was second time pardon, recidivist pardon. I think she did like counterfeit 5-hour energy drinks the first time and then new fraud the second time. You start looking at down this list. Danny Preston Conrad, Ari Eric DeJong. Then you have the people in Puerto Rico, the governor, and then the people who are involved in this bribery scheme there. Just a notable thing also is that the underlying sentences under this DOJ to begin with, like things that should be felonies, were being kind of charged as misdemeanors in the first place. And then you're seeing misdemeanor pardons that are kind of taking place. And then I guess it's a way to double dip on the quid pro quo. You get the misdemeanor with the first $2.5 million to the Trump PAC. And then you've got the extra $1.5 million for the pardon of the misdemeanor. This way they kind of, they drag it out. Liz was the former pardon attorney, first appointed under the Biden administration, then your term continued under the Trump administration, and famously or infamously, I suppose, you were fired as the pardon attorney after Pam Bondi, and everyone said, hey, Liz, we'd like you to help us with Mel Gibson. He's a big Trumper. You want to help him there, and we'll talk about that. So, Liz, I want to jump right into all of these corrupt pardons, potentially these secret pardons, but I could go through the list of others. Sadly, people know about a lot of these, but, I know Trump wants to distract Juan Orlando Hernandez, one of the biggest drug traffickers in American history, worked with El Chapo, said, let's get those drugs right up the nose of the gringos and kill him during a federal trial. Like, pardon that guy. CZ from Binance, and they pled guilty to engaging in a massive money laundering scheme to get this crypto money to terrorism and sex trafficking. He gets a pardon, then he helps Trump's family with the crypto endeavor before and after. First, let's talk about the secret stash. Then let's go into some of the pardons and these restitution orders that basically have forgiven lots of money that these crooks and criminals should be paying to our country in response to their conviction. So, Liz, great to see you, first of all. Talk to us, though. You think there are more pardons potentially out there, huh?
Well, I don't know that there are more pardons, but it certainly seems like a possibility. One of the things that's been so unusual about how Donald Trump has been doing pardons is that he is granting them in secret. There's no public announcement made when he grants a pardon. Typically, we're just learning about these things as they come to light and as people are digging them up. So it is entirely possible that Donald Trump has signed more pardons that have not yet come to light. It's possible that he has granted pardons for people in his inner circle, including his family and his cabinet members. I don't know if he has or he hasn't, but it certainly seems possible that he may have signed other pardons and that those may be, sitting somewhere until they are needed. One thing that has also come up is the idea that Donald Trump could pardon this ICE officer in Minnesota who has been involved in the killing, who killed Renee Good in Minneapolis, and he could potentially pardon all ICE officers. We hear people in his inner circle. We hear Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance talking about absolute immunity for ICE officers. They don't actually legally have absolute immunity. So you have to wonder, does that refer to the idea that the president is planning to pardon those people? We really just have no way of knowing what the full extent of the pardons has been or will be because they have been so secretive.
Yeah, I mean, look, it goes from you holding the line on something that is that would be non-controversial in prior DOJs. You don't just pick up the phone. Hey, this actor, he's a big supporter. He was convicted of domestic violence back in 2011. Hey, Liz, help get him his guns back. Just do me a solid, and you do the right thing. What are you talking about? Absolutely not. But it seems like now the qualifications for your job is not just to return the guns, but and I'm not trying to say this facetiously, it's like, who will commit domestic violence again with Mel Gibson? Let's pick that person, bring them in. And then the order is, let's just pick the most corrupt people and then have the pardon attorney go and figure out a deal where Mel Gibson puts money in Qatari bank accounts for Donald Trump, and maybe build Donald Trump a home or build part of his library out. It's so egregious right now that I just don't think people sometimes reflect on. None of this is normal. And
Yeah.
You rose through the ranks as a public defender and were there during normal times. I watched this myself as a lawyer, and I'm like, what world are we even living? What is this?
Yeah, the pardons that have been granted are just so unusual in so many respects, but one being the fact that relationships seem to be driving the decision making in many, if not most, of these cases. We learned about a case in which Trump pardoned someone, essentially made the decision over a round of golf. Trump played golf with Trey Gowdy, who's a former member of Congress, a Republican. Trey Gowdy said, "Hey, my client needs your help here." And then days later, he got a full pardon. We heard about a woman who attended a dinner at Mar-a-Lago. She paid $1 million to go to this dinner, and she pitched the president on a pardon for her son, who was convicted of a very large-scale fraud offense. And days later, he got a full pardon. We're hearing about people who are making large donations to Donald Trump. You mentioned the donations that were made in the case of the former governor of Puerto Rico and her co-defendants, which totaled $3.5 million given to Trump's super PAC, MAGA Inc., and that resulted in full pardons of 3 people, including the former governor. We know about a number of other cases where large donations have been made to Donald Trump, or investments have been made in his family businesses, as in the case of the billionaire Changpeng Zhao with his crypto company. And these are paying dividends in the form of full pardons that are based not on the merit of the case, but on the ability to leverage connections or wealth.
And the pardons, the part that you've also focused on, the restitution component and forgiving the fact that I don't think people realize that in a lot of these criminal cases, the penalty is not just prison. The penalty is also, for these fraudsters, restitution, meaning paying back what you stole or what you took. And then when people get these pardons or clemency, tell me, you could explain if there's a difference between the two in terms of restitution. They don't have to, they get to keep their money, or does the money get returned? But this is I think your latest calculation is over $1 billion right now that should be going to the government, because it's stolen money or fraudulent money now stays in the hands of the fraudsters. They get rewarded for their fraud. They get to keep the spoils of their crimes.
Yeah, so typically in normal times, pardons are reserved for people who have already paid their debts, people who've served their sentence in full, people who have paid any financial penalties that they owe to victims or otherwise, and who have demonstrated compelling rehabilitation. They've really rebuilt their lives, shown remorse, and demonstrated that they are deserving of this extraordinary form of relief. Not the case in Donald Trump's world. Donald Trump has been pardoning people who have served none of their sentence and who paid back none of their debts. And there are some really egregious examples. There's a guy named Trevor Milton who was at one time a billionaire. He built a company that was basically built on lies. He claimed that he was building the world's first electric-powered semi-truck. He created a promotional video that showed supposedly a working prototype of the truck. It turns out he had a team of people actually roll this truck down a hill, and it didn't work at all. He didn't have the technology, but still he raised hundreds of millions millions of dollars from investors who believed that they were going to make money on this investment. And many of them were people like teachers and retirees and folks who really didn't have a lot of money to lose. And in the end, Milton was going to have to pay back almost $700 million to those people he defrauded. He made some large donations to Donald Trump, totaling around $2 million. And then he got a full pardon, which wiped out his nearly $700 million debt. So all of those people that were owed money by Trevor Milton now have no ability to collect that money through restitution, which is really just not the way the pardon power is supposed to work. Donald Trump is making these decisions without consulting the victims of crimes, without consulting the prosecutors who have built these cases, the judges that have imposed these sentences. And again, that is really just not how this process is intended to work. I have been keeping track of the total amount of debts that Donald Trump has forgiven through pardons and commutations. And you can find all of that information on my Substack on it's Lawyer Oyer. I'm keeping a tally, and I added in the most recent pardons, which were granted last week. And the total number is now over $1.5 billion. Donald Trump has wiped out over $1.5 billion in debts that are owed by people or were owed by people convicted of crimes, owed to victims of crime and taxpayers.
Yeah, you look at Milton too, commits all this fraud right before the election as he knows everything's going down. He gives $1.8 million, $1.8 million to Trump. And then you think about all the victims of his fraud who would normally be entitled to restitution. But that brings me to the final point, which is the idea of victims, or in the case of some cases, survivors, depending on the types of cases, we're talking about, and how the DOJ has turned hostile to the victims and the survivors and have propped up the bad guys. I mean, I'm looking at the case USA v. Ghislaine, and in a typical case, USA is representing the victims of the sex trafficking. But it seems USA v. Ghislaine should be USA and Ghislaine, because they often take the same positions on these things. And so as you're watching, even in the Epstein case, the moves that like Congressmember Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie are making now to say, hey, judge, we need you to intervene because there's no longer an adversarial process with good guy and bad guy. And then the DOJ says, well, you guys don't have standing. It's just DOJ v. Ghislaine. The whole adversarial process of a criminal case where people are supposed to be fighting for the victims and against the bad guys has been turned on its head. So you look at these cases and then the judges are like, the typical process is the DOJ brings these things to our attention. What happens when they don't do it? The judges can't just freelance and be like, hey, I got to do your job for you. Things have to be requested. And so, I don't know, it exposed these massive flaws in our system, but the idea of fighting for victims on behalf of victims and survivors has been thrown out the window, and nowhere more have we seen that, I think, with the cover-up of the Epstein files and the Transparency Act being so blatantly violated.
Yeah, I think what you're saying really gets at a larger problem in the Justice Department, which is that the Justice Department is now run by people who used to be Donald Trump's personal lawyers, and they are still operating as though they are Donald Trump's lawyers. In reality, the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General should be representing the people of the United States, but Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche are treating their jobs as though they are still Donald Trump's personal lawyers, and their job above all else is to cover for him. What we saw Todd Blanche do in the case of Ghislaine Maxwell was really, truly shocking and disgraceful, frankly. He went down to a prison in Florida. He visited Maxwell. He took a statement from her that appears to have been an attempt to exonerate Donald Trump from any involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. And then he facilitated her transfer to a lower security, nicer prison facility. And that was all done in the interest of Donald Trump. There is no case to be made that that was done in the interest of the American people. And that's what we're seeing really across the board inside the Justice Department now, is the leaders of that department treating the workforce and the powers they have as though it is Donald Trump's personal law firm.
Before we go, anything else you think that we haven't covered that's just on your mind or that you see happening around the corner that you just want our viewers and our 6 million subscribers to kind of to start focusing on because you see something developing and we'll have you back to discuss it. But anything that you're like, let's talk about this.
One of the most troubling things that I'm seeing recently and that I've been following closely is the situation in Minnesota and the things that are being done and not done there. We're seeing a situation where the Justice Department is now investigating pretty much everyone under the sun except for the ICE officer who committed the shooting, who killed Renee Good. We have a situation where career prosecutors are quitting in droves because they know that what the Justice Department is doing is essentially becoming complicit in the cover-up of the actual facts of this shooting. So DOJ is refusing to do a civil rights investigation of the killing, which in and of itself is extraordinary. That's their job. They are instead investigating the victim and her spouse. They're investigating the protesters. They're investigating the governor of Minnesota and the mayor of Minneapolis. And you've got top people like Todd Blanche making statements accusing these government officials of engaging in terrorism. You've got them talking about the victim as a domestic terrorist. So what we're seeing is really the building of an alternate reality, a completely false narrative that just has no basis in reality. And it is chilling to see this coming from the top levels of the Justice Department. So I'm keeping a very close eye on what's going on in that case. I'm posting about it regularly on my Instagram, which is again, Liz Oyer, and you can see my latest updates there. And please have me back to talk about that situation as it continues to unfold.
Absolutely. And you and I should do some joint Substacks, to some video Substacks together also. And go live and we can bring people breaking news there. So great to have you on. Everybody check out Liz Oyer's Substack and her Instagram and other socials. Liz, thanks for everything.
Thanks so much for the conversation.
And everybody, let's hit subscribe here and let's get to 6 million subscribers.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.